Hello, today we are going to discuss selection of alternates by constraint plans. So, what are the objectives of this lesson? After completing this lesson, you should be able to set up and select alternate resources, discuss how you can set up and select substitute components, explain how to set up and select alternate work definitions and item structures, set up and select alternate sources, and finally set up and select alternate suppliers. So what does this feature do and what are the benefits? As we know, in today's world, it is very difficult for a human to manually evaluate the millions of possible combinations of supply sources, alternate components, resources, and manufacturing methods to fulfill the demand on time. This new feature in Supply Planning Cloud optimally resolves resource and material capacity constraints, which results in increased supply chain efficiency and reduced costs. In addition, it helps selecting combinations of supply sources and manufacturing methods that will enable the fulfillment of demand on time. Basically, supply planning evaluates alternate sources, alternate work definitions, alternate resources, and substitute components, as well as to ensure that supply orders can meet the demand on time while using on-hand and on-order inventory in the most efficient manner possible. The first section we are going over is how to use alternate resources. First is to set up the alternate resource. The setup is done in Fusion Supply Chain Execution, and in there you should navigate to manage work definitions. The next step is to select and edit the resource for which alternate needs to be defined. While assigning primary resource to an operation, click on the plus sign in the alternate field to create alternate resources. Then in the alternates screen, select alternate resources from the drop-down list and assign a priority to an alternate resource. If there are more than one alternate resource, supply planning will give preference to the highest priority, which is the lowest number. Finally, click OK and save. Here we are showing that you can also create alternate resources for simulation purpose in supply chain planning through a simulation set. Here are the steps to create an alternate resource in supply chain planning. First, open routings table in a simulation set. Next, select the routing resources pane, and then select the resource, and from the Actions menu, select Duplicate. Then, in the Create Resource screen, select the alternate resource name from drop-down, and then select the primary resource and specify a priority. Another way to create alternate resources in supply chain planning is by using flat file loads through FBDI. In this case, what you need to do is this. Select the supply chain planning routings template and add alternate resources in Routing Operation Resources tab. Please make sure that for the alternate resources, you specify an alternate number that is greater than 0 as shown here. Here we're showing how you can include the alternate resources in the planning process. Basically, resource capacity constraints are evaluated when supply planning mode is selected as constraint. You can choose whether to evaluate all the resources in the facility or just the bottleneck resources. If use alternate resources option is selected under decision rules, supply planning will use alternate resource to avoid overloads on primary resource. Here we see, as a result of including alternate resources, the plan has selected the alternate resource to avoid overloads on the primary resource. In this section, we discuss how to use substitute components. First, you need to set up substitute components. To do that, you need to go to Product Information Management module. Then, in the Item Structure Details screen, select the primary component for which substitutes need to be defined. And finally, in the Substitute tab, define substitute components and enter its details. One important detail is to assign respective priorities to substitute components. Supply planning will give preference to the highest priority, which is the lowest number, while determining among substitute components. You can also create substitute components for simulation purpose in supply chain planning through a simulation set. To do that, go to the item structure table in a simulation set. There should already exist a substitute component in item structure in order for planning to create more substitute components by duplicating it. Here we have the Create Substitute Component screen. For creating a substitute component, you need to select one from the drop-down and save it, and assign a substitute component priority. Here we are showing what I just mentioned, assigning a substitute component priority and quantity. You can also create substitute components in supply chain planning using flat-filed loads through FBDI. To do this, you need to select the supply chain planning item structures template and add substitute components in BOM Component Substitutes tab. Basically, you need to provide usage quantity and substitution priority of the substitute component item. Here we are showing how you can include the substitute components in the planning process. If Use Substitute Components checkbox is checked under Decision Rules, then supply planning will use some substitute components to minimize demand lateness or capacity overloads. Planning process basically using existing supplies of primary component in order to satisfy demand on time before selecting substitutes. Please note that multiple substitute components for a primary component can exist. And supply planning also minimizes excess inventory at the end of the planning horizon. Here we have an example of selection of substitute component by planning process. In this example, the processing lead time for the assembly is 5 days. For the primary component is also 5 days. For the substitute component is 1 day. And there are demands on assembly at various days in planning horizon. Due to processing lead time constraint, new supplies can be created after 10 days from plan start date, which can cause demand lateness. In order to avoid it, supply planning has recommended supplies on substitute components. In this section, we discuss how to use alternate work definitions and item structures. Here we see defining a work definition, and as part of that, selecting appropriate item structure name. Here we are showing how to create an alternate work definition in Fusion Supply Chain Execution. Basically, in the Create Work Definition screen, you need to select the product for which alternate work definition to be defined, and also select work definition name from drop-down list. And then enter production priority as 1 for primary work definition that are most commonly used in item production, or a higher number for an alternate work definition. Here is the next step, which is specifying the details for alternate work definition. Basically, you need to assign various components and resources to different operations as needed by business. You can also create alternate routings in supply chain planning through FPDI. To do this, you need to select the supply chain planning routings template and add alternate routing definition in all tabs as needed. Please note that you should provide alternate routing designator name after than primary to define alternate work definitions. One other note, the alternate BOM designator name should match with the alternate routing designator name in order to load the corresponding item structure for a routing. Here we are showing you can include the alternate work definitions and item structures in the planning process. If use alternate item structures and work definitions checkbox is checked under decision rules, then supply planning will use alternate item structures and work definitions in case material or resource or both in primary work definition item structure are causing delay or having overloads in meeting demand on time. As I said earlier, planners can define priorities for alternate item structures and work definitions. Here we have an example of selection of alternate work definitions and item structures by planning process. In this example, here we see the resource and component from the alternate work definition and alternate item structure are selected to avoid overload on primary resource. In this section, we discuss how to use alternate sources. First, you need to set up alternate sources sourcing rule. You can define various sources of supplies in a sourcing rule. Supply planning uses the rank that planners have assigned to select among various sources. In the example shown here, there is a transfer sourcing rule in organization M1 to transfer material from organization M2 or organization M3. As specified in the rank column by numbers 1 and 2, the transfer from org M2 is of a higher priority than compared to transfer from org M3. Here we are showing how you can include the alternate sources in the planning process. Basically, to instruct planning engine to select alternate sources, you need to select the checkbox Use Alternate Supplier and Source Organizations in Constraints and Decision Rules tab. By default, the planning engine tries to minimize the use of alternate sources. But if it is necessary to use the alternate sources, then the planning engine uses the rank that you have assigned to the source for selecting the alternates. Here we have an example of selection of alternate sources by planning process. In this example, the rank 1 source is organization M2, and the rank 2 source is organization M3. The transit time between organization M2 and M1 is 15 days, and the transit time between organization M3 and M1 is 1 day. Even though the transfer from M2 is of a higher priority, supply planning has chosen an alternate source org M3 to avoid demand lateness. In the last section, we discussed how to use alternate suppliers. As I mentioned in the previous section, you can define various sources of supply in a sourcing rule. Supply planning uses the rank that planners have assigned to select among various suppliers. Here we are showing how you can include the alternate suppliers in the planning process. Basically, to instruct the planning engine to select alternate suppliers, you need to select the checkbox Use Alternate Supplier and Source Organizations in Constraints and Decision Rule tab. Just like source organizations, you can define the priority of alternate suppliers in the sourcing rule. By default, supply planning tries to minimize the use of alternate suppliers, but if it is necessary to use the alternate suppliers to meet demand on time, supply planning uses the rank that planners have assigned to select among the alternates. Here we have an example of selection of alternate supplier by planning process. In this example, supply planning has selected an alternate supplier since the primary supplier, Big Mart, has insufficient supplier capacity to fulfill the demand on time. Here we have some additional information related to selection of alternates. Basically, demand satisfaction carries a higher priority than the need to respect resource and supplier capacity constraints. If there exists a capacity constraint on demand due date in supply chain, supply planning first tries to satisfy the demand in an earlier time bucket using the primary sources of supply. If there is no capacity available on primary on or before demand due date, it selects alternate sources of supply. If there is no capacity available either on primary or alternate on or before demand due date to fulfill demand on time, then supply planning overloads capacity. We have some more additional information here. Supply planning will use this sequence for alternate selections. First, use alternate resources. Next, use substitute components. Then use alternate item structure and work definitions. Finally, use alternate suppliers and source organizations. So, what you should have learned in this lesson are these. You should be able to set up and select alternate resources, discuss how you can set up and select substitute components, explain how to set up and select alternate work definitions and item structures, set up and select alternate sources, and finally, set up and select alternate suppliers.